In the access control chapter, we're going to take a look at another mechanism that Spring Security provides to secure our domain objects within our applications. So, what are we talking about when we say our domain objects? Well, let's think about the application we've been building. Within our domain, we have two objects, an auto user and an appointment. So these are those fundamental objects that really comprise the bare bones of our application. Sometimes they'll correspond very closely with the entities that we're storing in our database and the tables within the database. In our instance, appointment corresponds exactly with our database and we store that information there. And appointment is an important domain object that makes up our system. Now, when we think about those objects, obviously we're storing that information into our database and then we retrieve it back out at certain points and we make instances of those objects. Well, some of those instances may belong to one user, while other instances of appointment may belong to another. So, for example, I may have a list of appointments that I have scheduled, and you may have another list that you have scheduled. Well, access control allows us to get very granular with the types of permissions that we grant to a user on those instances. So, for example, maybe you would like me to be able to view your appointments. So I have read access on every appointment that you have scheduled. Now, maybe you have access to write to those different appointments. So if you want to change something, you would need that write permission. So there we're discerning at a permission level what you have access to and what I have access to, and they can differ. In order to comprise that information, we need to construct what is known as an access control entry. And an access control entry is comprised of a principal, an object, so in this case, whatever appointment we'd be looking at, and then a permission, whether it be read, write, there's administration. So that combination of information is used to form an access control entry. And access control entries form our access control list. Within Spring Security, there are some out-of-the-box components that support ACLs. If we choose to use those components, we need to adhere to a default schema that Spring Security requires us to follow. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at that schema and we will set it up within our application. Once we have the schema set up, then we're going to work through and build out access control entries. Now, these are quite complex. There's roughly 4 tables, and there's some relationships between all of the tables that we'll discuss. Once we have built our access control entries, or ACEs, then we will look at the Spring Security configuration of those out-of-the-box components. This is probably one of the most in-depth configurations that you will find within Spring, let alone Spring Security. So we will walk through and discuss each of those components, and it's important to pay close attention at that point. Once we have those components in place, then we're ready to integrate the ACL features into our application. And what we'll be doing is using annotations on our controller to consult our access control list when we have to make a decision regarding a permission on a domain object instance. In this lesson, we're going to learn a more granular approach to security that focuses on the actual object level. So we are looking at a principal, an object instance, and a permission, and we're using our access control list to determine whether or not to authorize some operation on that object instance.